foreclosures. And non-judicial foreclosures are also known as trustee sales. So typically what happens in a foreclosure process is somebody falls behind in their mortgage.
Right.
And usually the bank will let you go maybe a month or two, get behind, they'll send you letters.
Right.
And then finally, they decide, enough's enough, and they start the foreclosure process. Now, if it's a trustee sale, the first thing that will happen is that they will record against the property what's called a notice of default. And that tells the whole world that the loan is in default, and that starts a deadline. And the deadline is 90 days. So there's a 90-day period where the lender has to wait before they can then send out what's called the notice of sale. And the notice of sale sets the sale date.
And that final 90 days, that's where the occupant can cure?
That's correct. Actually, the borrower can cure the loan all the way up to 5 days before the sale date.
That's right.
But the purpose of the 90 days is, you're exactly right, Pat, is to give the borrower some time to solve the problem. Okay? And there's several ways the borrower can do that.
Okay, so in terms, we've had the deadlines. Now, what should an occupant or borrower do in response while this is going on, provided there's not a divorce or custody battle or things like that happening?
Right. Well, just to briefly explain what a foreclosure is so that a borrower understands, what the bank is doing, in essence, is enforcing their lien against the property. And if the borrower doesn't do anything, eventually the property will be sold, and the borrower will lose ownership of the property. So it's important for the borrower to react. Now, what the borrower can do, there's several things. First of all, the borrower can try and negotiate with the bank, try and arrange a workout agreement, some type of payment plan, maybe pay a higher amount for a few months, try and catch up, basically, is what the purpose of that is.
Or, for instance, take the past payments and add them to the back of the loan.
Sure, that's possible.
Things like that.
Yeah, something that's temporary that the borrower can live with, that'll stop the foreclosure process. That's the most important thing.
Now, also, it's important to have a bank that has had experience in this area, because in different markets, or for instance during a deep recession, banks will have a division specializing in foreclosures, and their employees will know how to handle this. But in some markets, you may not have individuals at the bank that can take these phone calls and handle them correctly. Do they outsource this, or do they?
Well, I would say probably generally they handle it in-house, but I would say for the most part, banks, they do not like to take properties back.
Right.
Yeah, they're not in the business of holding real estate.
They don't like to have departments that are in the business of taking homes back.
Exactly. And as you know, the names of those departments are banks, are called the REO departments, real estate owned, which refers to that part of the bank's portfolio of the real estate that they own. But again, that's not the business they're in. So a borrower has a decent chance of trying to arrange some sort of payment plan because the bank is really not that interested in carrying out the foreclosure. They would rather have a loan that's in place.
Okay, oftentimes, depending on the markets, if there's a time where a seller of a home will take back, say, $40,000, $50,000, $80,000 in the form of a second to help the buyer buy the house originally.
Right.
So there's a first loan from a big bank, and then the second loan from a retiree. And oftentimes they make payments on the first loan, but they don't make payments to the retiree.
Right.
So in that case, the retiree has to have their own foreclosure process.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And so when the foreclosure goes forward, if the borrower doesn't work something out with the retiree lender, or doesn't sell the property or solve the problem some other way, and the sale actually goes forward, then what happens is that whoever shows up at the sale and buys the property, they buy the interest that the foreclosing lender had. So in this case, the retiree seller who took back the second had a second, so the buyer at the foreclosure sale will come into second position, and they will take the property subject to the first,
Right.
held by the big bank, in your
Right.
example.
Now, that's why, because oftentimes it's in those markets that I was speaking about is what I call realtor-driven, where realtors will often suggest to the retirees to take back a second loan to help the buyer buy the home. And then they have a casual statement, oh, if they don't make payments, you could just foreclose on them.
Right.
So it's not that simple.
It's not that simple. There's a lot of risk to that for the seller carrying back. You know, basically what happens in the carryback situation is that you're making the seller a partner with the buyer, because
Right.
the seller's recovery of the loan that they're making is dependent upon the success of a buyer. We've been talking about residential real estate, but say in the context of the sale of a commercial property. A lot of times the buyers cannot obtain typical institutional financing. They have to get creative, and a lot of times the seller will carry back a note. Well, you know, that's risky, because you know, if the buyer doesn't succeed, then you know the seller is going to have to depend upon the equity in the property to try and recover.
Right. What's, in addition to that, the retiree, let's say, has to make payments on the first bank loan, for instance, if they're behind on the first loan.
That's correct.
So
Chances are, if the borrower is defaulting on the second,
They're
he may be defaulting on the first as well.
Right.
On the other hand, he may be keeping up with the payments on the first and just defaulting on the second. So if the retiree forecloses and becomes the buyer at the foreclosure sale
Right.
and winds up taking the property back, or if some other third-party buyer shows up at the foreclosure sale and buys the property, whoever it is, they're going to take subject to that first, and you're right, they're going to have to, from that point forward, make the payments on the first. Otherwise, the first can foreclose.
So I understand a lot of times the retirees don't have the means to go through that process, and they're just wiped out.
Well, that's true.
Or can be.
They can be, that's right.
Okay. But now let's say if they did that, how do you do that properly? Oftentimes the retiree is not aware that the borrower or buyer is behind on the payments. So there's something about a notice of default that you could file at the county courthouse, so if they're behind?
That's correct. If they're in second position, in your example, the retiree,
Right.
they give a notice they record a notice that tells the lender in first position that if there's ever a default, then they have to notify the second lender, the retiree in second position. They have to send them a copy of the notice of default.
Sure.
Because what happens is if the first lender forecloses and that goes to a sale, then the buyer who buys at that foreclosure sale steps into the shoes of the lender in first position. Well, guess what? If that happens, then the person in second position gets wiped out.
Right.
So the rule is that junior lien holders get wiped out, and those are called sold out juniors or wiped out juniors. And so that's why they want to know if there's any problems with somebody ahead of them, they want to get notice of that.